Hey, Center Grace family, happy Wednesday to you. Good to be back again this week as we're continuing our way through the trellis. We've almost worked our way through all of these different topics. But again, the whole goal of this is for us to understand discipleship as a part of all of life, and that all of life, everything that we do, fits into the way that we follow Jesus. And today we're going to actually continue our conversation on the trellis through something that I think really fits in with this time of year, and that is our money and how we spend the resource that God has given us, specifically when it comes to our finances. Martin Luther once famously said that a Christian goes through 3 conversions. That first, their heart converts, that their affections begin to slowly but ever so surely turn away from the world and towards Jesus, who he is and what he's done. And then secondly, our minds. Our minds convert. We begin thinking more on Jesus. We want to study the Word. We want to understand better who he is and what he's asked us to do. But then finally, our wallets. And strangely enough, that is what Luther actually picked on. He didn't say our lives in general. He said our money. And the way that I refer to that, I guess, in some sense, would be that there's the conversion of our affections, our attention, and then finally, in general anyway, our actions. And over the course of time, more and more, we want all of our lives to come into conformity with who Jesus is and what he's taught us. And Jesus definitely had a lot to say about the idea of money. But when you think about the idea of our affections and our attention and our actions, when you think about that progression in one sense, there is oftentimes a disconnect, right? Because I can love Jesus deeply with my heart. I can think about Jesus with my head, but I may not actually do the things that Jesus has invited me to do, especially with my money. So what is that disconnect, and where does that come from? And at the outset, as we talk about that, I want you to just remember that discipleship is not built upon what we do with our money. So in other words, you're not a disciple of Jesus because of what you do with your money, but rather it's because you are a disciple that you begin to do different things with your money. Remember, don't ever forget, church, that identity precedes activity. We always do things based on who we are, but our activity can in many ways reinforce our identity. The way that we go about organizing our lives, doing the things that God has invited us in to do, it reminds us again and again that we're not our own, that we belong to Jesus. And the same is true when we think about what we do with our money. And again, that's what we want to talk about today. Jesus spoke a ton about money. And he didn't just speak what he taught to the rich. He also spoke to many poor people. Think in particular of, again, the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 6. We're going to just look at 2 verses today as we unpack this idea of money. Matthew 6:24 and verse 33. But just to set the stage, I want to remind you, just in general, that first of all, when Jesus spoke about money, he didn't just speak of it as if it was a medium of exchange. Jesus understood money to be a rival god. We're going to see in the text in just a second that Jesus referred to it as mammon. It was like Jesus was personifying money as if it was a god. But Jesus also understood that it wasn't just the rich who struggled with idolizing or worshiping money. It was also the poor. And I wonder why that is. Because again, when Jesus was giving that famous Sermon on the Mount, he wasn't speaking to just rich people. He was speaking predominantly to the impoverished. But Jesus understood that whether you have a lot of money or whether you're poor, money can always be that rival god. But why? Well, in some sense, I think we're all tempted, whether we have a lot of money or whether we don't have a lot of money, we're all tempted to think that our significance, our security, and our satisfaction comes from money. And those 3 things are things that God alone can give. Significance, he's already told us who we are. Satisfaction, God alone is good, and he alone will ultimately satisfy us for all of eternity. And security, no matter what we have or we don't have, if all we have is Christ, we're secure. But we're tempted always to put our significance, our satisfaction, and our security in our money. And Jonathan Swift, that great satirical writer, once said that we spend money to buy things that we don't want to impress people that we don't really like. Think about how just that phrase, we spend money that we earn to buy things that we don't want, to impress people that we don't like. All three of those S's are found there, right? We spend money that we earn, our security, or what we think is our security, on what ultimately doesn't satisfy, on things that we don't want, to impress people that we don't really like. The idea of significance. Jesus is teaching us in Matthew chapter 6, when he gives this famous Sermon on the Mount, he teaches us two things in particular that I want to focus on today when it comes to money. And the first one is found in verse 24. Jesus says, no one can serve two masters, for either you will hate one and love the other, or you will be devoted to the one and despise the other. But you cannot serve both God and money. And the first thing that we need to see is that serving money will never satisfy. Serving money will never satisfy us. No matter what, no matter how much money we have, we always will want more. You see in the context of this passage that Jesus is describing just how much we want to clutch on to what we have. It's never enough. J.D. Rockefeller is famous for saying, when asked how much would be enough, how much money would be enough, he said, just a little more, just a little more. But money, when you think about it, again, money in and of itself is not a bad thing. It's the love of money, as Paul says in 1 Timothy, that's the root of evil. It's making money an ultimate thing, thinking that it's ultimately going to satisfy us, that becomes so dangerous. But money is not in and of itself an evil thing. It doesn't itself corrupt, but it will expose. Money in that sense is a lot like power, right? The more that you have, it just exposes what's in your heart. And if you think that money is ultimately going to satisfy, or the things that you're going to be able to buy are going to satisfy you, you're always going to be left feeling empty. So Jesus says that serving money will never satisfy us. Money, wealth, is a lot like drinking seawater, right? The more you drink, the thirstier you become. It's just never going to satisfy you. And that's what Jesus says. You can't serve money because it's not going to satisfy you. But then in verse 33, Jesus ends this section on teaching on money. And again, go back and look at the context. Because the whole context of when we put our significance and security and satisfaction in money, it leads to anxiety of all kinds, right? So Jesus ends this section in verse 33 by saying this: seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be added to you. And so this is the second thing, that not only is serving money never going to satisfy us, but if we seek money, we will never be secure. So seeking money will never make us secure, even though we think that it will. Remember the parable that Jesus told about the rich man who decided to build bigger barns? Because he thought that he would just be able to store stuff away. He was looking for security, and yet in the end, it didn't make him secure. Money, it's said, is a good servant, but it's a horrible master. Money is not going to protect you. It never will. It's not meant to. It's meant to serve us, not us to serve it. And when we think that money is somehow going to make us secure, and again, in the context here, Jesus talks about storing up things, but the bottom line is if we store up things thinking it's going to make us secure, in the end, it's going to rust. It's going to wear out. Somebody's going to break in and steal it, or it's just going to go away. It's ultimately not going to satisfy us, and it's not going to make us secure. So what do we do? How does discipleship in the way of Jesus, how does the gospel, how does seeking first the kingdom of heaven, how does serving God rather than serving money, how does that shape the way that we interact with money? Well, 4 quick things. First, we need to learn how to practice gratitude. Remember that everything that you have comes from God. In 1 Timothy 6, verse 17, Paul, writing to rich people, he actually talks about this. He says, you need to understand that everything that you have is given to you by God. And yes, God does at times want you to enjoy those things. But do you recognize that you didn't actually achieve those things? It comes from the hand of God. So are you grateful? Are you practicing gratitude with whatever it is that God has given you? But secondly, we need to practice stewardship. As we realize that everything comes from God, this takes us all the way back to the beginning in the garden in Genesis, right? God made us as human beings stewards over everything that he has made, and that includes our money, our resource. Do we understand that God has entrusted it to us for a time for his glory, not for our selfish gain? So not only do we need to practice stewardship, we give thanks, we return thanks to God for what he's given, but we practice stewardship. It's not ultimately ours. So if God asks us for it, we give it. Thirdly, not only do we practice generosity and stewardship, or gratitude and stewardship, but we need to practice simplicity. There's a great book. The title of is the idea of to will one thing. Simplicity in many respects is willing one thing. And I think if we're seeking first the kingdom of heaven, not money, but if we're seeking first the kingdom of heaven, internally, we're beginning to will one thing. And then that begins to affect the way that we utilize our money. So I think Luther is right, that there is the conversion of our affections, then there's the conversion of our mind, and then there's the conversion of our wallet. But when we're willing one thing, when we want Jesus above all things, we begin spending money differently. We practice simplicity. We don't need all the stuff that we think that we need. And then that leads us to the fourth thing, and that is that we can learn to practice generosity. The opposite of greed is not poverty, it's generosity. Think about that for a second. The opposite of greed isn't poverty. God doesn't want people necessarily to be poor, but he does call us to be generous. Paul in 2 Corinthians actually says it this way. He says, just like Jesus, who was rich, became poor on your behalf so that you might become rich, so it is that we as followers of Jesus, as God's grace begins affecting our hearts, we become generous people. We begin modeling the gospel with the way that we treat our money or the way that we treat our time and everything else. So are we practicing these things? Because when we practice gratitude and stewardship and simplicity and generosity, strangely enough, we stop serving money because we realize it's never going to satisfy. And we stop seeking money because we realize it's never going to give us security. We're praying for you guys. We'll see you on Sunday.